Video Games and High Culture 2021. Introductory Speech. Hello, and thank you all for being here, physically or in a psycho-virtual connection. Today, we will not present our multidisciplinary project Video Games and High Culture. We did it in the other editions, and you can find a presentation video on our official website. Today, we will try to build clarity by plunging into the abyss of contemporary, chaotic conflicts in the global post-truth society. This brief introduction to the fourth narrative edition of this project stems mainly from three reflections. First reflection. The first reflection comes from an observation by my friend Nico Belletta, head of program at DevCom. Nico, in the past, suggested to me that for the spin-offs of this project at DevCom, it would have been better not to use complex slides. Nico was absolutely right. Playing too much with bizarre images destroys any attention in our Vidum society. This is why I decided to use an even more grotesque and disturbing video today during this speech. Addressing the topics of this project must be a challenge. We want this to be a Souls-like talk, because our reality is increasingly confused, fragmented, and conflicting in the individual minds of global players and spectators. Second reflection. The second reflection arises from Professor Jos de Mul's final comment on my introduction to Homo CyberLudens, a miscellaneous essay published in late 2021. Obviously, it was a huge pleasure to know that my introduction was not an absurd set of disorganized opinions, but I was also amazed that Professor Jos de Mul's final comment was that he was disappointed that I had not clarified my position on games and video games. It is true, up to now, especially on a personal level, I have created questions. I have made problematic reflections on many issues, but I have not taken a clear position. After all the studies, the meetings, and the reflections made so far, I believe I cannot have a clear position. To do this, I would have to put aside the contradictions, paradoxes, and aporias that are a central part of what, perhaps, we have understood so far about games and video games. Playfulness, this mysterious object capable of generating meaning in the space-time of humanity. So, for now, in all honesty, I surrender to my inability to take a stand on games and video games. I'm just certain that we should change the modern meaning of the word ludic to include the ludic and playful joy of destruction and control beyond the common sense of childish, carefree, light and creative play. Third reflection. The third reflection, which is actually an observation, is that we are at war, but not against a virus. Viruses live and act like viruses. War is a word, a phenomenon, a definition of meaning created by humanity. And war, from the very origins of what we call civilization, has been a formidable subject for storytelling, games, destruction, and the creation of new identities and perceptions of reality. The biggest problem is that we are at the centre of an undeclared, paradoxical global war. We are at the centre of a war that cannot break out in conventional mode between nuclear superpowers. The last chance to conquer the world in a horrific, conventional way was played by the Nazi fascism and the empire of the rising sun in the last century. Today, in theory, no one wants to fight a major war in which everyone loses. Despite this, in important geopolitical magazines such as Limes, it is no longer taboo to talk about the possible military clash between the US and China in the coming years. A Chinese landing in Taiwan is a real possibility. It almost seems that the palpable tensions and the military preparations in the South China Sea can serve to write the rules of a sort of war game with limited objectives, in which the nuclear obliteration of humanity can be avoided. The reconquest of Ukraine by the former Russian Empire, born from the dissolution of the Soviet Union, is a concrete military option that could give rise to unthinkable and unpredictable scenarios. We will see if in this infodemic millennium, in which the story of emergencies seems to never end, East and West will come to a classic military clash. Meanwhile, all the other wars, waged not only by the great continental blocs, are designed with a ludic structure to take place on the most shocking of battlefields, our minds. The following is part of my introduction to the Homo CyberLudens essay. In an enlightening article by General Fabio Mini entitled "Wars Don't Break Out Anymore," he explicitly illustrates how the classic war paradigms are exhausted. The former NATO commander gives insight into today's military teaching that has codified war generations. Two of these generations strikes us the most, as we believe they are part of the daily life of our Homo CyberLudens, the fifth and sixth generation. The general states the following about these recent historical phases of war. The fifth generation has removed all conceptual bonds from war. Unrestricted warfare, or war without limits, uses all means, including financial ones, to impose its interest on the world. The paradigm of war without limits aims to demolish the intellectual strength of an opponent by pushing him beyond his own moral and mental limits, forcing him to compromise, and compromise above all on an ethical level. It contrasts different intellectual abilities. The fifth generation must conceal its own war nature and must not be perceived as war. It must make people indifferent to war, avoidance, mystification. It requires the ability to detach oneself from one's own thought system and evaluate events from a multiple perspective. It moves with long strategic visions and imperceptible and rapid operational interventions. Today, war plans are drawn up in the name of the synchronic or diachronic combination of the last three generations. They can be unleashed for any reason, old and new, but with the criminalization of the adversaries, with the recourse to fear, and with the Manichaean division between good and bad, between good and evil, between good and blasphemous religions. We are witnessing the return of impersonal gods of money, of the myths of strength and wealth, of the rites of the imposition of force, and of the human sacrifices on the altars of arrogance and stupidity. And then the sixth generation of war was inaugurated, the gang war, which, especially in the Western context, configures a degraded and degenerated system on a moral and institutional level that contrasts with the hard and pure image that the West wants to project of itself. Very harsh words, followed by the further insight into the decline of the fungibility of classical military force, and a discussion about the multiplication of a series of war forms and modes that globally have been created to continue to confront and fight an enemy increasingly difficult to identify. The list of existing unconventional wars which could easily have been born out of the dark creativity of a good game designer is impressive. Fabio Mini talks about, among others, of irregular war, asymmetric war, wicked war, criminal war, war of the third kind, non-Trinitarian war, new war, counter-war, war amongst the people, deterrence by punishment, three-block war, compound war, net war, insurgency, global guerrilla, economic jihad, economic holy war, information warfare, financial warfare, resource warfare, cyber warfare, chaoplexic warfare, war of chaotic systems, hybrid war, psychological warfare, propaganda, deception and coercion, media warfare, manipulation of national and international public opinion, legal warfare, use of legal regimes to beat an opponent. General Mini confirms that the boundaries between the worlds of imagination and those of material reality are constantly undergoing change, and also outlines a scenario in his article that we would have considered science fiction up until a few years ago. The military industry is already, in 2015, developing human-machine integration and cognitive expansion systems of the human brain. To govern increasingly complex machines and systems, our pilots and soldiers must prepare to undergo a lobotomy to have a microchip installed in the brain that increases its capacity, or to undergo a series of automatisms that will completely remove awareness of what is happening. Perhaps, however, the General's analysis comes to a culmination when he states, "Today, armies should not question themselves about the enemy to face and what strategies to adopt, but they should ask themselves who they work for and why." Homo CyberLudens, who is perennially connected and stimulated by cascades of bits, inside and outside the games that sometimes replicate by simplifying this furious ludic structure of contemporary wars, is the target and the objective to hit, seduce, manipulate, enlist and conquer. Well, what is the point and connection between war, video games, literature and high culture? Following the path traced by Huizinga, and not fearing, but rather including the dark path of human destructiveness in our vision of reality, we believe that the ludus is the spark and the meaning-creating structure of civilization. Historia ludens, as Professor Antonia Brusa would say. We believe that all current unconventional wars are fought using powerful, soft power tools that tap into the fundamental archetypes of the storytelling game. We play at telling stories that form our identities, and we are in full identity crisis, lost in the chaotic flow of thousands of forms of entertainment. Up to now, we have played the role of ourselves. In the future, perhaps, we will jump from one role to another without even knowing when this happens. the ancient pillars of the hero's journey are evident in a recent hit series with a very evocative name, Squid Game. In this successful series, we see a narrative centered around the theme of the cruel social game, with a protagonist who embodies the classic irresponsible loser who turns into a conscious fighter against the injustices of the world. A Korean series which once more testifies to the rise of Asian cultural influence in a world that was previously dominated by Europa Universalis. Roberta Talamo, literary theorist, convinced me that great literature is now dead. But perhaps this death is not irreversible, and has somehow given birth to a gigantic game of narratives that has its roots in the ancient high culture and that is expanding in myriad directions. Last questions before concluding this chaotic whirlwind. Why are we so narratively excited about the possible birth of the so-called singularity? Millions of new autonomous intelligences are born every year. About 132 million more intelligences this year. 80 million more humans on Earth this year. Are we bored with our human children for hoping so much for the birth of a cybernetic child? Or are we looking for a new father, awful but right, after the death of God in the short century? Personally, I am not at all excited by the generation of a new autonomous cyber consciousness capable, in theory, of solving all our material problems, of writing and making us play stories made specifically for us, each of us, who is already considered by the market as a single, selfish and childish entity. I fear very much all the implications of the games we are playing in and out of the universes or metaverses we have created. I think it is very likely that in our lives we will see a brutal revenge of material reality that will devastate virtual toy cities. Unless we decide to lock ourselves with a smile on our face in dark, immaterial, golden cages. My hope lies in the awareness of the intention of the author. It is now very clear that games and video games are the most powerful and pervasive tool for communication and identity creation. I believe that games no longer have to prove anything to culture. It is the culture that must understand that it is a game. I believe that, aware of our limitations, we must continue to study, reflect, and try to create a game that problematically seek truth, not that create artificial truths for the illusion of absolute control of life.